that I think it would be impossible to ignore, and I think all the judges felt the same way, that this was bringing to light some terrible abuses that have happened throughout the world, throughout history. And Christina Lamb also casts insight into why it's happened. She even talks to a former ISIS fighter who was suspected of carrying out some of this violence in an effort to try and discover why it has been so widespread.
What happens in this book, and of course it at times makes shocking and horrifying reading, but what happens is that it brings home to us what is the reality of war. War is terrible. Men so often, as our leaders, too readily embrace the concept that war is the solution to some of the problems in the world, and forget the full horror of it. It's the storytelling which is so important to this, and she does that with such beautiful prose, but also with such humanity. And that's why this is not the scary book, the gory book that one doesn't want to read about, especially when it's about something that is about such pain, such humiliation and degradation for mainly women, but not exclusively. But she does that in a way that makes it one of the most important books I've read in many, many years.
So I've been working as a foreign correspondent for 33 years, mostly in areas of conflict, and I've always been really interested in what happens to the women, and I've always found it much more interesting the people that are sort of behind the lines trying to look after their children and educate and feed them and protect the elderly. So I've always talked to women because it's mostly them that have done that. And I'm much more interested in that than the bang bang. And to me, that's very heroic what they do. But there's also a dark side in what happens to women in war, and that's the use of sexual abuse, of rape as a weapon of war. And I have to say that I have been absolutely shocked in the last few years. I have seen far more brutality against women than at any time in my previous 2.5 decades of reporting, and I found that extremely difficult to understand why something so terrible was happening on such a wide scale in the 21st century. So I started asking questions more and more about why it was happening and what anybody was doing to stop it.
This business of rape in certain places, particularly in conflicts which are more national conflicts, conflicts which are about denying the humanity of people because they're of a different religion, a different ethnicity, because in some way you want to deny their existence, and therefore a genocide of them by tearing at the very heart of what reproduces new generations, by raping and destroying the tender parts of a woman to prevent that happening. Those stories are here, and we need to hear them, because they're not going to be on our screens in the news. They can't get that kind of coverage. And so it's the words that have to sear into our souls to make us do something about stopping this stuff.
You know, when I started talking to people about this, people's attitude was, well, there's always been rape in war. And that's true. If you go back to the sort of ancient Greeks and Romans and Persians, the first written book of history by Herodotus opens with abductions of women. But as I said, we are in the 21st century. It doesn't seem right to me that something so terrible is still happening and that we're kind of saying, oh, well, it's gone on forever, so that's okay. And the other thing was that when I started looking into it, I mean, this was rape being used as a weapon of war, people being told specifically to go and do this. It wasn't that rape was happening as part of the just general chaos of war when law and order broke down. So, you know, something more is going on. And, you know, the problem is it's a very effective weapon. It's cheap, right? It costs less than a Kalashnikov bullet. And if you want to clear a village so that you can take it over, if you rape the women, humiliate the men, by doing that, it's an easy way to clear people out, terrify people, make the men feel they can't protect the women. If you want to try and change the ethnic balance, or for various reasons people were doing it, sometimes religious, ideological, ethnic, but the fact is that it's happening on a very vast scale.
I've long admired Christina Lamb as a war reporter. We've been to the same countries, to Afghanistan, and she has a way of bringing across the humanity in the midst of conflict, making us really understand what it's like to be in those countries where people have suffered so much. But her 30-year career has been employed throughout this book, so she goes back to places that she's visited before, and it's the eyewitness testimony, what she's able to find out from these women and girls, actually, sometimes children, of the kind of horrific abuse that they've suffered, but with a purpose, which is to try to make sure that this kind of pain doesn't happen again.
Now, I think, and I happen to believe this is true, that it took a woman as a journalist in conflict, covering the conflicts of the world, to actually bring her perspective, her eye, but also to give the confidence to the victims of this kind of war crime to speak to her and speak out, because it's very hard for women to give voice to the experiences that they've had in conflict.
So I had already reported from some of these places, but when I started looking into it more, and I focused on places where it was used as a weapon of war, I mean, honestly, I think I could have spent the rest of my life reporting on this, because it's happening in so many places. So in the book, I went to 12 different countries on 5 continents. And I also wanted to bring in some of the recent history of it, just to try and put in context and explain why there's been no justice. And so I actually went to Bosnia, which I think for many of us was the first time that we really heard about this. And there was, outrage at the time in the 90s about the idea of rape camps in the center of Europe. And people said, never again. So I went to speak to some of the women there, and I mean, to my astonishment, they said to me that very few of the men had been brought to justice, and in fact there's some incredibly brave women there who've set up their own group trying to track down some of the perpetrators, and have actually themselves brought to justice more than 100 of the rapists. So that is quite incredible.
Let's be clear, anybody who reads Christina Lamb's book will be taken on a harrowing journey, but it's such an important one because she describes the kind of suffering of women in war all over the world throughout history that's almost been happening in plain sight. As she says herself at the very end of the book, every time I see a war memorial, I wonder why there are only men's names there, not those of women.
It's a book to give to everybody, understanding what is behind some of the terrible experiences that women have. One of the things that's so important here is that so often women, and particularly because of the socialization of women, the ways in which women culturally can come to put their needs at the bottom of the list. When you go into a place and ask what has happened after some tragedy and the firing of a village or whatever, is that women will say, my child has been killed, my husband's been beheaded, my family has been slaughtered, our homes have been destroyed and our crops and everything. And the last thing they'll tell you is, and I have been violated. And you know that's because the way in which they have had to internalize their own personal pain has buried some of the most horrifying things that they've gone through.
As I pushed open the black metal gate in a suburban street of northern Manila and entered a small house, Inside, a stray marmalade cat wandered through, arching its tail into a question mark, and two little old ladies met and embraced. They discussed their health, their grandchildren and great-grandchildren, the journey there to Quezon City in the capital's notorious traffic, nothing out of the ordinary. They were there, however, because they shared a most terrible bond. When they were girls so young that they had not even started their periods, they were raped over and over by Japanese soldiers who had occupied their country. On the wall behind them, row upon row of faces of old women looked out from a photo montage, some stern, some kindly, some gazing directly, some looking away with haunted eyes. All of them were comfort women, kept as sex slaves by the Imperial Japanese Army during World War II, in one of the biggest officially sanctioned systems of sexual violence and trafficking in history. It's a term they don't like, preferring Lolas, an affectionate name for grandmother in the local Tagalog language. Those on the wall are the departed. They died without receiving justice. No apology, no compensation, not even an acknowledgement of the terrible wrong that was done to them. Their own country's history books carry no mention of them. Among them was Lola Priscilla, who after her captivity could never again sleep a full night, so embroidered murals of flowers and houses while her children were sleeping, and Antonita, who used to loiter around the crumbling Spanish fort in the remains of the old walled city, so she could point tourists to the dungeons where the Japanese executed her husband before she was enslaved. Of those who came forward, only 9 were known to be left, most of them bedridden, hard of hearing or suffering dementia. Lola Narcisa and Lola Estelita are among the last survivors still standing, both knowing they will almost certainly die without justice. Lola Narcisa, who everyone calls Lola Isang, was just 12 when the Japanese soldiers came for her in 1942. Everything about her was neat, from her black dress sprigged with white leaves and matching black and white slip-on sandals, to her short white hair tucked behind her ears, small gold rings in her ears, and the single gold band on her wedding finger. When she cried, the tears fell neatly and silently, and she dabbed at her eyes with a perfect white flannel square taken from her flower-embroidered bag. The ordeal she was describing happened more than 75 years ago, yet to this day, if she hears screaming, she freezes, thinking Japanese soldiers are coming. It is an everlasting nightmare, she said.